So, my first question is, what got you interested in carbon capture?
Actually, we started on this probably about 10 years back when I started working at WVU. And there are two things that which we really wanted to do there. First thing is that we tried to really work with the carbon capture technology developers so that the commercialization of the new technologies can be done very fast. So typically, like any other chemical technologies, it takes you 20 to 30 years before a lab scale technology actually see the commercialization. Why that is actually so important? Because if you really think about it, even last year in 2020, even with COVID, we had about 7% drop in the CO2 production all over the world. But if you look into it, like in 2019, there were about like 36 billion ton of CO2 that is being released, right? And the ppm of CO2, which is parts per million, it actually keeps rising. Like if you look into in 2018, there was about 2.5 ppm increase. So right now, our CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is about 410 parts per million. So this is increasing actually at an alarming rate. And the problem is that, like, even though we know that this is a problem and the CO2 concentration is rising in the atmosphere, the solution cannot be overnight. That's the biggest problem. It's not like many other things that we can replace it overnight because a lot of CO2 are being released from things like power production. So if I actually try to cut it down, where from we get the power? So obviously that solution cannot come overnight. So there are two things. One is the new technologies that needs to be developed, okay, that can reduce the overall carbon footprint. And the second thing is that you have to still expand the infrastructure. So if you really think about like replacing a lot of renewable energies that are coming to the grid, the problem is it requires massive amount of infrastructure and capital expenditure. So obviously that solution is not going to come overnight. That solutions may not be feasible for all region. Like for example, if you think here today in West Virginia, you do not see the sun. Like you probably didn't see it for last 3 days or whatever. Like during winter, we neither have wind energy like Texas, we nor have the solar energy like California. These solutions is expected to vary from country to country, region to region. So CO2 capture is one solution in the mix because our region, like West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Ohio, in this region, we have so many power plants. They're generating CO2. So if they can continue to generate the power and we capture the CO2 at such a level that when the flue gas is released to the atmosphere, it's not polluting as it is doing right now. So that's really the thought that where we started. And we have been working for all these 10 years with many technology developers. Um, and working as part of US Department of Energy. Our project has always been funded by them, and we have been working with the researchers at US Department of Energy, along with many international test centers. So we are part of something called the International Test Center Network. So there are all over European Union and US and Australia and many other countries. There is a test center. Like for example, you develop a new technology, you take the technology to that center and you test it out and generate the data, use it for improving your process more and more. So we work with them actually.
So, two of your projects had to do with stopping the CO2 from getting out to begin with, sort of thing, or like, like with the whole like natural gas and coal power plants from that sort of source. And then there's one that's about like taking CO2 from the air that's already sort of there and getting that out, right?
Exactly. The first one that is actually what we call the post-combustion capture. So meaning that you combust coal or natural gas, or it could be anything, like even for our car, when we are burning gasoline, we are generating CO2. So anywhere the fuel is combusted, and it's a hydrocarbon. So when it reacts with oxygen, it produces CO2. So you combust, and then from the combustion gas, you capture CO2. That will retrofit many of the existing processes. There is another technology which is known as the pre-combustion capture. So it's basically before the hydrocarbon combust, you convert it and then you capture CO2 from there. So there are some technology which is working in that domain. We have some paper also on that area. It is basically the gasification technology is one of them. So you start with coal or a natural gas or something like that. Any hydrocarbon fuel, you can gasify it, produce hydrogen from there, and then you combust hydrogen. So that when you combust, you produces water. So that way, and then CO2 is captured. So those are pre-combustion capture. There is a third one which is called the oxy-combustion. So oxy-combustion is basically instead of air, you combust with oxygen. Okay, when you combust with oxygen, it still produces CO2. But if you think about hydrocarbon, like you have carbon and hydrogen, it reacts with oxygen to produce CO2 and water. Water can be condensed, then you get pure CO2. So that's the third type of technology. And this new one that which we just talked about, the direct air capture, this is actually a very new topic. It still has to get the ground, like firm footing in European Union. They have already started. I think there are 3 or 4 pilot plant project, and there is a company that is actually working extensively in developing these. So that's a really new thing, I would say. You will not be able to capture everything at the source. It is so distributed. Like for example, how do you capture it from the car? So if I continue to drive the car, the CO2 will get to the atmosphere. So in like in a big city, if you're thinking about, there are so many cars driving, like for example electric car, yes, that's also a solution, but that may not be the solution in all the places and not probably in a foreseeable future. There are other sources, like for example, what about the aircraft, right? All the planes, they will still be generating CO2. So there will be CO2 from such distributed sources that you cannot capture locally. It will come to the atmosphere. That's actually a very big contribution of this pollution also. So when it goes to the atmosphere, you have to still capture it from the atmosphere. So that's these new technologies, that direct air capture is something coming up very aggressively actually all over the world.
But it seems very fascinating to me because it seems very difficult to do, to try and figure out how you can sort of do carbon capture and also make it profitable and I guess commercialize as well. Is that like sort of like what you're working on as well? Is sort of like trying to like drive down some of the costs and stuff like that, or?
Yes, meaning there are two things here. So one is that previously the thought was that carbon capture is an option. That was the thought. Like for example, I may capture or I may not. But going forward in the future, if a plant is emitting large amount of CO2, it will be shut down. That's actually written on the wall. You can see how many coal-fired power plants have been shut down in the country. And every day you look into the news, one of the plant is getting shut down. And I personally work with some of them, and I know that we work with some plants in New Mexico, near it's a couple of hours from Albuquerque, New Mexico. They shut down. Actually, all the New Mexico, there is no coal-fired power plants. California is not taking any non-green power imported from outside. Like Wyoming used to sell power to California. They cannot sell it now because the Wyoming most of the power is from the coal-fired power plants. California would not buy that. So they're basically saying, tell me the source of your power. Is it from a green source? Then I will purchase it. If that some sort of carbon mitigation technique is not implemented, it is expected that some high carbon emitting plants will be running out of business. There are multiple things that what we're looking into is that what solutions are feasible for a certain region or the state. The immediate solution that people are running after is shutting down the coal-fired power plants, and the slack is being taken up by the natural gas combined fired power plants. So the moment you move from coal to natural gas, your CO2 emission drops actually significantly. So that's the immediate solution. However, that's not enough because natural gas combined plant, they also produce a lot of CO2. So eventually they would not be sustainable from an environmental perspective. So what is the solution? Because ultimately, if everybody is doing the capture, whatever is the cost, it will be paid, transferred over to the customers. However, that means that if the cost gets passed on to the customer, in some sense, the cost of energy goes up. It's not only passing on to the customers. It is basically energy is a very big driver, as you know, for the economy. If the cost goes up, the economy will have a big dent. So the question is, how can we can still take care of these large amount of CO2 emission, but at a reduced cost. They have trying to reduce two costs. One is the capital cost, which is basically meaning how much dollar I have to put on the ground to have the plant or the industry being there. And then the next cost is the operating cost. Like every month or every day or every moment, how much dollar I need to spend. So it's a recurring cost. So we are basically trying to reduce both capital cost and the operating cost and the footprint. So that is basically saying, can I have compact plant like small plants, lower capital cost and lower cost, overall cost for these, and they should be fast. So if I want to change, I can switch from whatever we are capturing. So today morning, actually, we had a call with a European Union consortium. Actually, we are working on a proposal with them, and the idea is actually flexible capture. And the thought is that it is being led by UK, and the idea is they're basically saying during the daytime, most of the energy will be coming from the renewables, but during evening through the night, it has to go back to the conventional power plant. But during that time, the conventional power plant has to do CO2 capture. And that CO2 capture has to be very high, like 99.99% or so. So what needs to be done to make our technologies ready to immediately go to that high level of CO2 capture. So all over the world, there is a consensus that some level of CO2 carbon mitigation needs to be done.
Is there anything else that you like wanted to add?
We look forward to playing a critical role for not only for the country, but I think this is a problem that which we need to tackle for the entire world, for sustainability of the world and the existence of the future generation. This is a problem that which we really need to work on. And so what we are bringing to the table is that as a state university, we are playing our role not only for like on a technology perspective, but also from the perspective of different policies, in the sense that what you will see that from many of our papers, what we try to evaluate is that, say, if I had to impose a carbon tax, what it would be. You basically say that if somebody will be emitting this much of CO2, you have to pay this much of tax. In other words, we're trying to see that what are the different avenues to make CO2 capture practical. And we are also looking in the same time to many futuristic things in terms of like direct air capture. Another thing is called a BECCS, BECCS. That stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So that is a negative emission technology. So what it means is that it is not only not at all generating CO2, but it is also taking the CO2 down. So we have been also working as part of that. So eventually, like if there are many successful commercial facilities like that, we hope that in the future, eventually we'll be able to handle it. Because as the point what I was trying to make is that, first of all, this is increasing like around 2 to 3 ppm per year. So first of all, even if we want to be where we are, we have to capture equivalent to that, what is corresponding to that 3 ppm. That's actually several billion tons of CO2. So first we have to reach that target. Once we reach that target, then we have to go to the next level of target, which is going down. That means that when we have to, whatever we have accumulated in the atmosphere already, then we have to keep cleaning the atmosphere so that we can go to a much more comfortable level. So we are working towards an environment where it is not only like doing a kind of a steady state at the current situation, but rather going forward in the future, in several years effort, we'll be able to go back to where we were like about 30, 40 years back.